Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. Pull up a chair, get comfortable, maybe pour yourself a cup of coffee. Today, we are going to talk about something we usually try to avoid. We live in a culture that is absolutely obsessed with success. We study the unicorns, the titans of industry, the visionaries who supposedly saw the future and built empires out of thin air. We read their biographies, we dissect their morning routines, and we try to reverse engineer their triumphs. But today, we are flipping the script completely. We are going to explore a counterintuitive, yet profoundly true premise: failure is a far more profound teacher than success. Success, you see, is a terrible teacher. It seduces you into thinking you are infallible. It breeds hubris. Failure, on the other hand, tells you the unvarnished, brutal truth. To do this, we are going to take a massive, uninterrupted journey through the archives of corporate disaster. Guided by the brilliant insights from Haig's book, Brand Failures, the truth about the 100 biggest branding mistakes of all time. We are going to dissect the spectacular, multi-million-dollar catastrophes of some of the biggest companies on the planet. And through these stories, we are going to learn what a brand actually is, why it breaks, and how the human psyche dictates the rise and fall of global empires. Let's start by traveling back in time to the late 19th century, right around the 1880s. The Industrial Revolution is roaring. Suddenly, goods are being mass-produced in factories hundreds of miles away from the people who are actually buying them. Before this, if you wanted oats, you went to the local shopkeeper. You looked him in the eye, you knew his name, you trusted him. But now, you are buying a sealed box of oats that came off a mechanical assembly line. Naturally, the public was highly skeptical, even terrified, of these mass-produced goods. Was it safe? Was it adulterated? To bridge this massive trust gap, companies had to invent something new. They invented the brand. And in those early days, a brand was essentially a protective shield. It was a mechanism to ease consumer anxiety. Think about the earliest iconic brands: Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, the Quaker Oats Man. What do they all have in common? They are human faces. They are smiling, reassuring, deeply human avatars designed to transfer the trust you used to have in your local shopkeeper directly to the corporation. The brand was the solution to the problem of industrial anonymity. But why does this matter today? Because in the 21st century, we have experienced a complete inversion of this dynamic. Today, the brand is rarely the protective shield. More often than not, the brand is the problem. Brands have become victims of their own spectacular success. We have reached a point where perception is actually more important than the physical product itself. You don't buy a pair of Nikes just because the rubber and mesh are structurally superior. You buy them because of what the swoosh signals to the world. This brings us to the ultimate paradox of modern business: fragility. Because consumers make purchasing decisions based almost entirely on brand perception. A brand can become infinitely more valuable than a company's physical assets, its factories, its warehouses, its inventory. But that exact same dynamic makes the brand incredibly fragile. In our modern age of the internet, social media, and 24-hour news cycles, a brand's image, a corporate identity that took 100 years and billions of dollars to build, can be reduced to ashes overnight by a single scandal, a viral rumor, or a catastrophic lapse in judgment. Haig points out a fascinating phenomenon he calls the migratory syndrome. Because brands are so desperate to maintain their perception and grow, they develop a herd mentality. They blindly follow competitors into new markets without doing the psychological math. Think of the fashion cafe trying to mimic the success of Planet Hollywood. They see a competitor succeeding in a space, and they think, "We have a strong brand, we can do that too." They migrate into territories where they do not belong, leading to a collective stampede off a financial cliff. So, how does a brand actually fail? Haig identifies what he calls the 7 deadly sins of branding. These aren't just spreadsheet errors. These are deep psychological and strategic flaws. The first sin is brand amnesia. This is when a company simply forgets what it originally stood for. It forgets its core identity, its soul. The second sin is brand ego. This is the delusion of invincibility. It's when a brand overestimates its own power and decides to enter markets where it has absolutely no business being. Imagine Harley-Davidson, the ultimate symbol of rugged, leather-clad, masculine rebellion, deciding to sell a line of perfumes and colognes. It actually happened, and it was a disaster, because Harley-Davidson let its ego blind it to its actual identity. The third sin is brand megalomania. This is the insatiable desire to take over the world by expanding your brand name into every possible product category, diluting your identity until it means absolutely nothing. The fourth is brand deception. This is the cynical attempt to use slick marketing and beautiful advertising to cover up the reality of a fundamentally flawed, terrible product. It's putting lipstick on a pig, and the consumer always finds out. The fifth sin is brand fatigue. This is a fascinating one. It happens when the executives inside a company get bored with their own brand. They look at the same logo, the same colors, the same messaging every single day, and they get tired of it. So they change it, completely forgetting that the consumer, who only interacts with the brand for maybe 5 seconds a day, isn't bored at all. The sixth sin is brand paranoia. This is the anxious, reactive brand that is constantly looking over its shoulder at competitors, rebranding every 6 months, or suing rivals unnecessarily, projecting insecurity to the entire market. And finally, the seventh sin is brand irrelevance. This is the tragic failure to evolve when a market undergoes a fundamental, seismic shift. The classic example here is Kodak. They invented the digital camera, but they buried it because they were terrified of cannibalizing their film business. They chose to remain relevant to the past, and so they became irrelevant to the future. Before we get into the stories, we have to clear the deck of some massive industry myths. If you went to business school, you probably absorbed these as gospel, but the history of failure proves them wrong. Myth number 1: a good product guarantees success. Absolutely false. History is littered with superior products that died in the gutter because of poor branding and strategy. We'll talk about Betamax versus VHS shortly, which is the ultimate proof of this. Myth number 2: big companies are safe. False. Larger brands are actually more vulnerable because they have so much further to fall, and their size makes them slow and arrogant. Myth number 3: advertising builds strong brands. False again. Advertising is just a megaphone. It cannot fix a fundamentally flawed brand concept. It just amplifies the flaw and burns through cash. And myth number 4: novelty equals success. R.J.R. Nabisco once spent a fortune developing a smokeless cigarette. It was a technological marvel. It was completely novel. And it failed miserably, because they completely ignored the psychological reality of their consumer. Smokers actually enjoy the smoke. The ritual, the exhale, the sensory experience, that is what they were buying, not just a nicotine delivery system. Now let's transition from theory to practice. Let's look at the granddaddy of all brand failures. The story that is taught in every marketing class in the world, but is rarely understood on a deep, psychological level. I am talking, of course, about New Coke. To understand this disaster, you have to understand the context of the Cola Wars. In the 1950s, Coca-Cola was untouchable. They were outselling Pepsi 5-1. Coke was America in a bottle. But by the 1970s and 80s, Pepsi launched a brilliant, aggressive campaign called the Pepsi Challenge. They went to malls across America, blindfolded people, and gave them a sip of Coke and a sip of Pepsi. The results were undeniable. In a blind, single-sip taste test, consumers preferred the sweeter flavor of Pepsi. Furthermore, Pepsi brilliantly positioned itself as the brand of youth. They called themselves the Pepsi Generation. They hired Michael Jackson. They made Coke look like the stodgy, tired drink of your grandparents. By 1983, Coca-Cola's market share had plummeted to an all-time low of under 24%. To make matters worse, Coke had launched Diet Coke, which was a massive success. But it was cannibalizing the sales of their original flagship product. Inside Coca-Cola headquarters, panic set in. The leadership, spearheaded by CEO Roberto Gazretta, looked at the data from the Pepsi challenge and came to a disastrously logical conclusion. They concluded that the physical taste of the liquid was the single, solitary reason they were losing market share. This is where the fatal error occurs. This is why it matters so much. Coke treated their product as a chemical formula, a mere collection of ingredients, rather than what it truly was, a cultural icon. They believed they could just swap out the liquid and keep the magic. So, they spent millions developing a sweeter formula, New Coke, and in an act of breathtaking hubris, they decided to completely kill off the original formula, the real thing. They assumed that because people liked the sweeter taste in blind tests, they would naturally accept the change in brand identity. But marketing is not a blind taste test. Nobody drinks a Coke blindfolded in a sterile room. You drink it at a baseball game. You drink it at a family barbecue on the 4th of July. You drink it because it connects you to your childhood. When New Coke launched in 1985, the public backlash was apocalyptic. People hoarded the old Coke in their basements. Protest groups were formed. People called the company in tears, acting as if a beloved family member had been murdered. Why? Because Coke violated the emotional bond they had with the consumer. Now, the legacy of New Coke is incredibly fascinating. Within 79 days, Coca-Cola caved. They brought back the original formula as Coca-Cola Classic, and sales absolutely skyrocketed, eventually crushing Pepsi. The reversal was so successful that conspiracy theorists to this day argue that it was all a planned marketing ploy, a genius manipulation to make the public remember how much they loved Coke. But as Coca-Cola executive Donald Keough famously said, "We are not that smart, and we are not that dumb. It was a genuine, terrifying mistake." Pepsi's CEO at the time, Roger Enrico, observed this entire saga and noted that the event taught Coca-Cola a priceless lesson. They realized they were not just owners of a formula, they were caregivers of a legacy. The New Coke disaster cemented several profound truths. First, as positioning expert Jack Trout says, marketing is a battle of perception, not a battle of products. Second, never imitate your competitor. By mimicking Pepsi's sweetness, Coke abandoned its own soul. We've seen this fail time and time again. Think of Mr. Pibb trying to be Dr. Pepper, or Fruitopia trying to be Snapple. Third, the concept of love marks. The most successful brands create emotional bonds that exist entirely independent of the product's physical quality. And finally, Coke proved that admitting a mistake and backtracking can actually strengthen consumer intimacy. They showed vulnerability, and the public rewarded them for it. But let's move from the beverage aisle to the highway. If New Coke is the most famous mistake, the Ford Edsel is the ultimate, textbook example of a comprehensive, top-to-bottom disaster. It has been called the Titanic of automobiles. The year is 1957. Ford decides they need a new mid-priced car to compete with General Motors. They pour unprecedented resources into this project. And they start by building the hype machine. Months before anyone even sees the car, Ford runs mysterious ads. The Edsel is coming. They keep the cars hidden under tarps at dealerships, creating a sense of almost unbearable mystery. In the first week, 3 million people flocked to showrooms just to see this miracle machine. But here is the danger of hype. If you build massive, world-changing expectations, the product must actually be revolutionary. If it's just okay, the disappointment will completely kill the brand. And the Edsel was not revolutionary. The failure began with the name. Ford actually spent massive amounts of money on naming research. They sent teams to major cities, they interviewed thousands of people, they even hired the famous poet Marianne Moore to come up with elegant Evocative names. And what did the executives do? Chairman Ernest Breech and Henry Ford II looked at all the data, ignored every single piece of it, and decided to name the car Edsel, after Henry Ford's son. It was pure, unadulterated executive ego. Ford's own PR director, Gail Warnock, warned them. He said the name sounded like weasel, or pretzel, and he predicted it would cost them 200,000 lost sales. He was completely right. Then there was the design. The original, visionary design of the car was actually quite beautiful. But it was slowly chipped away by the bean counters, the accountants who said it was too expensive to produce. The final design featured this bizarre, vertical, horse collar, grille on the front. The public mocked it mercilessly. Critics said it looked like an Oldsmobile biting a lemon. Others, more crudely, said it looked like a toilet seat. Add to this a staggering lack of quality control. The mechanical quality was abysmal. Cars arrived at dealerships with parts that didn't fit, and dealers couldn't even get spare parts to fix them. And then, there was the market mismatch. Ford launched a massive, expensive, gas-guzzling land yacht in September of 1957, right at the onset of an economic recession. Consumers suddenly wanted smaller, fuel-efficient cars. Furthermore, launching in September meant the Edsel was competing against heavily discounted 1957 models from other brands. The outcome was catastrophic. Ford aimed for 200,000 sales in the first year. They sold barely 60,000. By 1959, the Edsel was dead. But here is the silver lining, the lesson learned from the ashes of failure. Ford took this humiliating defeat, internalized it, and completely changed their philosophy. They realized that the Edsel failed because it was product-focused. They built a product based on executive ego and then tried to force the market to buy it. So, for their next major project, they became customer-focused. They researched exactly what the market actually wanted, and they built it. That car was the 1964 Ford Mustang, one of the most successful vehicles in automotive history. Now, let's pivot to the world of technology. There is a famous rule in branding, popularized by Al Ries, called the law of leadership. It states that it is better to be first to market than it is to be better. And in many industries, this is true. Domino's was first in pizza delivery. Coca-Cola was first in cola. But in the technology sector, being the first mover is often a devastating trap. Why? Because consumer behavior evolves much slower than technological breakthroughs. Enter Sony Betamax. Launched in 1975, Betamax was a marvel of engineering. It was the pioneer of home video recording. But Sony made a fatal strategic error. They decided to keep the Betamax technology proprietary. They locked it down. They didn't want to share their toys. Just a year later, in 1976, JVC launched a competing format called VHS. But JVC took the exact opposite approach. They licensed VHS technology to anyone and everyone, Panasonic, Hitachi, RCA. They opened the ecosystem. What happened next is the ultimate lesson in ecosystem over quality. Every single tech expert agreed that Sony's Betamax had vastly superior picture and sound quality. It was technically the better product. But because the systems were incompatible, consumers had to make a choice. And because JVC licensed VHS to everyone, VHS players completely flooded the market. This mass production drove the price down. JVC and its partners were able to undercut Sony's price point by about $300. Think about that from the consumer's perspective. You can buy the superior Betamax, but it costs $300 more, and none of your friends have it, so you can't swap tapes with them. Or you can buy the slightly lower quality VHS, save a fortune, and rent thousands of movies from the local video store because every studio is producing on VHS to reach the larger market. Betamax proves that in technology, a closed, superior product will almost always lose to an open, inferior product that has better market distribution. Being first doesn't matter if you build a walled garden that no one can afford to enter. This brings us to a broader philosophical point about why global giants fail. Brand failure is rarely a mystery. It almost always stems from a massive disconnect between corporate perception and consumer reality. Branding is entirely a matter of perception, yes, but that perception must be anchored in the reality of the product. A brilliant, multi-million-dollar marketing strategy cannot force someone to buy a product they genuinely do not want, or at least, it can't force them to buy it twice. Many of these failures are born from a specific type of corporate hubris. Companies convince themselves that they know more about the consumer than the consumer knows about themselves. They sit in boardroom echo chambers, looking at focus group data, and they interpret their own ideas as visionary, while the public looks at the exact same product and sees it as utterly ridiculous. Perhaps the most embarrassing example of this is Microsoft Bob. Let's set the scene. It's the mid-1990s. Personal computers are entering homes, but the Windows operating system is still seen as a bit intimidating for the average person. Microsoft, in its infinite wisdom, decides to create a social interface to make computing friendly. They release Microsoft Bob. Imagine booting up your computer, and instead of a desktop, you are looking at a cartoon living room. To open the word processor, you click on a cartoon notepad. To open the clock, you click on a cartoon clock on the wall. And guiding you through all of this is a cast of aggressively cheerful cartoon characters, led by a dog named Rover and a mouse named Scuzz. Here is the fatal flaw. Microsoft Bob was software designed for adults, meant to be used in homes and offices. But the execution was so childish, so patronizingly juvenile, that no adult felt comfortable using it. Imagine sitting in your home office, trying to balance your checkbook, and a cartoon dog with a speech bubble pops up to give you financial advice. It insulted the user's intelligence. And this is a cardinal rule of branding. A brand fails the exact millisecond that consumers refuse to accept the identity the product forces upon them. Microsoft thought they were being accessible. The public thought they were being treated like toddlers. Perception versus reality. But what happens when a company actually tries to solve a real problem, but fundamentally misunderstands the context of the solution? Let's look at Kellogg's breakfast mates. In the late 1990s, Kellogg's astutely noticed a shift in consumer behavior. The world was speeding up. The on-the-go lifestyle was booming, and fast food was eating into traditional breakfast time. People didn't have time to sit down with a bowl of cornflakes. So, Kellogg's decided to invent the ultimate convenience product, Breakfast Mates. It was an all-in-one kit. Inside a plastic bowl, you got a serving of cereal, a plastic spoon, and a small box of aseptic milk. Aseptic milk is shelf-stable. It doesn't need to be refrigerated. On paper, in a boardroom, this sounds like a stroke of genius. Absolute convenience. But let's look at the 5 fatal factors of failure that killed Breakfast Mates. First, the milk. Yes, aseptic milk doesn't need to be refrigerated, which makes shipping and storing easy. But think about the consumer experience. The idea of pouring room temperature, warm milk over cereal is viscerally unappetizing to most Americans. It violated a core cultural norm. Second, retail displacement. Kellogg's realized people hated the warm milk idea. So they told supermarkets to put Breakfast Mates in the refrigerated dairy aisle so the milk would be cold. But this completely backfired. Why? Because consumers are creatures of habit. When you want cereal, you walk down the cereal aisle. Nobody goes to the dairy aisle to look for Frosted Flakes. The product was completely hidden from its target audience. Third, conflicting advertising. Kellogg's ran television commercials showing kids waking up early, quietly preparing Breakfast Mates, and letting their exhausted parents sleep in. It was a beautiful pitch. But the reality? The packaging was a nightmare. The plastic seal on the bowl and the foil on the milk were so difficult to open that a child couldn't do it without spilling milk everywhere. The kids still had to wake the parents up to open the convenient breakfast. Fourth, taste issues. Even when the milk was chilled, consumers perceived the overall quality of the kit as distinctly inferior to just pouring a fresh bowl of cereal from a traditional box. And fifth, the price point. At over $1 per kit, it was exponentially more expensive than a standard bowl of cereal. When you put all this together, you realize the profound logical flaw of breakfast mates. It promised convenience, but it wasn't actually convenient enough to justify the compromises. You still needed to sit down. You still needed 2 hands to open it. You still needed to use a spoon. Contrast this with another product Kellogg's launched around the same time, the Nutri-Grain cereal bar. The Nutri-Grain bar was a massive success because it offered true, contextual convenience. You could unwrap it with one hand and eat it while steering your car on the morning commute. Breakfast mates failed because it offered the illusion of convenience without the reality. Finally, let's talk about synergy, hype, and the limits of marketing. Let's talk about Sony's 1998 movie, Godzilla. In the modern era, entertainment companies tried to treat films not just as movies, but as brand ecosystems. Following the blueprint laid down by George Lucas with Star Wars, Sony looked at Godzilla and saw a goldmine. They didn't just want box office receipts. They wanted toys, video games, clothing lines, fast food tie-ins. They treated the giant radioactive lizard as a corporate brand. Sony poured a staggering $60 million just into the marketing campaign. They generated massive hype. They used the brilliant teaser slogan, "Size does matter." They had billboards everywhere. They had the entire world waiting with bated breath to see this monster. But here is the ultimate lesson of the Godzilla failure: synergy and massive marketing budgets cannot save a brand if the core product is terrible. When the movie finally premiered, audiences hated it. The critics tore it to shreds. The script was bad, the acting was wooden, and the monster design alienated fans of the original Japanese films. In the 1950s, a studio might have been able to get away with this for a few weeks before the news spread. But in 1998, with the dawn of the internet and modern word of mouth, the toxic reviews spread like wildfire. The hype machine that Sony had built actually worked against them. Because the expectations were so astronomically high, the disappointment was catastrophic. People didn't just dislike the movie, they felt betrayed by the marketing. And when the core product fails, the entire brand ecosystem collapses. Nobody wants to buy the video game of a movie they hated. Nobody wants to wear the t-shirt of a cinematic punchline. Sony learned the hard way that you can market a bad product, but you can't force the culture to embrace it. So, what is the grand takeaway from all of these spectacular disasters? From the arrogance of New Coke, to the hubris of the Ford Edsel, to the tragedy of Betamax, to the comical misunderstandings of Microsoft Bob and breakfast mates? The lesson is that branding is fundamentally an exercise in psychology, empathy, and humility. A brand is not a logo. It is not a color palette. It is not a clever slogan or a $60 million ad campaign. A brand is the emotional, psychological space that a product occupies in the mind of the consumer. It is a fragile relationship built on trust, consistency, and a deep understanding of human behavior. When companies fail, they don't usually fail because they lack money or technology or smart people. They fail because they stop listening. They let their ego dictate their strategy. They look at spreadsheets instead of looking at human beings. They forget that at the end of every supply chain, at the end of every marketing funnel, there is a person making a choice based on how something makes them feel. Success might make you famous. But failure? Failure makes you wise. It forces you to strip away the vanity and confront the reality of the market. And in the world of branding, reality always gets the last word. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the wreckage. Until next time, keep your ego in check, listen to your audience. And remember, sometimes the best thing you can do is learn from someone else's $1 million mistake. Take care, everyone.